welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello. This week, Donald Trump wants to scrap a whole lot of climate change regulations.
To have the Trump administration declare all this a hoax and try to erase it, at a minimum, wastes precious time.
Also this week, we'll talk to a Native American leader about Trump's calls for sporting teams to bring back names ruled racist.
The Redskins word comes out of a time in American history of extreme violence and attempted extermination of our people.
But first,
Donald Trump's Liberation Day 2.0 tariffs have been unveiled. It's a patchwork of trade agreements, letters, memos, vague promises of investments. Some countries, like Australia and the UK, will be feeling like they got off lightly with a 10% base rate. Canada and Mexico still trying to wrangle some kind of better deal or enforce their earlier trade deals from Trump's first term. Others, like Brazil, are being punished with 50% tariffs that amount to trade sanctions for the prosecution of a Trump ally, Jair Bolsonaro, who modelled himself so closely on Donald Trump. He attempted to overturn a democratic election as well, but unlike Trump, he didn't manage to get re-elected before he could be prosecuted. We will have more to say about all of this on Monday night's program, but at least for now, Chaz, I guess we can say, well, one, American consumers are going to be paying a lot more for stuff at the store, and possibly the global free trade era is over, at least for the next 3.5 years.
Yep, we're talking the effective average tariff rate in America is now over 20% after all this. But we'll see about whether the era of free trade is over. Donald Trump has changed the tariffs literally hundreds of times this year already. Who would bet that the changes have stopped? Especially given the very day these tariffs came out, Trump was in court. He was in the appeals court, which was hearing whether these tariffs, all of them, are illegal. And
after all of that, they could just get ruled out.
Yeah, and I reckon they're going to say they are. So we'll see.
Yeah, indeed we will. Also this week, former US Vice President Kamala Harris has set off speculation about a possible 2028 presidential campaign after ruling out a run to become California's governor next year.
For now, my leadership and public service will not be in elected office. I look forward to getting back out and listening to the American people, helping elect Democrats across the nation who will fight fearlessly, and sharing more details in the months ahead about my own plans.
Kamala Harris ruling herself out of the California governor's race is good news for what is already a growing field of Democrats who definitely want that job, including former Congressman and Health Secretary Javier Becerra, former LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, former Representative Katie Porter is also in the mix. If Vice President Harris runs for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2028, she's likely to come up against the current California Governor, Gavin Newsom, who's term limited in Sacramento and is definitely running for the White House. And there are going to be any number of other governors and senators throwing their hats in the ring, Chaz. If Harris were to win the presidential nomination again in 2028, she'd be the first Democrat in over 70 years to lose one presidential election and then secure a second nomination 4 years later. Adlai Stevenson, he lost both times. Republican Richard Nixon won with his second nomination in 1968. That was after taking an 8-year break. What do you think? Is this laying the groundwork for a Harris 2028 presidential bid?
Well, she's definitely not too old, at least by Democrat standards. She'll be 64 in 2028. That's reasonable. If you look at what she says she's doing instead of running for governor of California, I think it's instructive. She says that she's going to be starting a fundraising organisation focused on how to empower younger voters while rethinking institutions key to democracy. She'll be creating a political action committee to raise money for other candidates. She'll be doing a listening tour of southern states, all wonderful options. She might as well have planning to run in 2028 tattooed on her forehead with those three options, John. They're just cliches. Yeah. Look, I didn't see people beating down the house for her to run for California. Governor of California. I'm not sure that Democrats necessarily super eager for her to be the next nominee after losing to a convicted felon. So if Kamala Harris comes back after the midterms, when they've been baying for some kind of leadership for the last 2 years, and now she's ready to go and she's all refreshed and relaxed and she's ready to take up where she left off, well, I reckon by then they would have moved on. They would have said, yeah, you had your chance, you blew it, we wanted you at another time, Not now. We've got other people to focus on now, and I think she might have lost a moment.
I think it's a little bit harsh. I think she could quite reasonably say, after that whirlwind 100 or so day campaign leading up to November, and what was, even though there's been a huge amount of soul searching and Trump keeps going about how big his victory was, let us remind ourselves that he won by 250,000 votes in 3 swing states. Yeah. So it wasn't a massive landslide, but it was a stronger victory for Trump than either Biden had enjoyed or Trump had in his previous election win. So it was, in modern terms, it was a significant size of victory. It wasn't disqualifying. There wasn't anything terrible about Harris's campaign. Yeah, she was very controlled. Yeah, she wasn't great in interviews, but she wasn't a dud candidate under the circumstances. She could rightly argue as well that she hasn't run for president twice. She's run 2 half campaigns. In 2020, she bowed out before the first primary or caucus in Iowa. And in 2024, she only got in when Joe Biden was forced out of the race at the 11th hour. If she had an 18-month campaign, which is what Obama had, which is what Hillary had, which is what Bill Clinton had, etc., she could reasonably think that she might well catch on. The big problem for her, though, is Democrats, well, you know, Republicans traditionally, they look at who's next in line. That changed in the Trump era, but for decades and decades, it was always who's the next grandee of the party, who's going to be the nominee next time around. Democrats have always liked the shiny new thing. You know, just when they're told, oh, you're going to have Hillary Clinton as your nominee, they go, oh, Barack Obama, I love him. And they fall in love. Republicans fall in line, Democrats fall in love. Whether Democrats can fall in love with Kamala Harris again, they kind of did last year. There was a lot of enthusiasm around her, relief mixed with enthusiasm, but they're already looking to other governors. Wes Moore of Maryland, he's got the sort of Obama air about him, a Rhodes Scholar and military veteran who's a centrist, can capture the Biden wing of the party, play well in a lot of the early states. Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, arguably the most important state in elections in the next 4 to 8 years. Pennsylvania, he's won there twice statewide. He could do very, very well as a Democratic nominee. There's a long, long line. I guess Harris figured there's no shortage of governors running for the Democratic nomination in 2028. Being California governor wasn't going to help her. It was going to hurt her because she would have had to have governed as a Liberal, and every press conference she gives in the next year will be, do you rule out running for president? And if she says yes, then she changes her mind, says, oh, the urgency of the moment, I have to run for president 2 months after I just got sworn in Sacramento. It wasn't ever going to work. Yeah,
no, I agree. And I think Democrats, like you said before, they're going to want to turn the page. They're going a new era. They're sick of this era, I think. Yeah. And whether she likes it or not, she's part of the last era.
Yeah, you could well be right. I think she'll run. But I don't expect her to be the nominee at this stage, but a lot is going to happen in the next, 18 months or so before that campaign gets underway. President Trump's second-term polling honeymoon, though, is well and truly over. His approval rating this week dipping to just 37% in the latest Gallup poll. That's only slightly better than his worst ever 34% at the end of his first term. You know, when he tried to overturn an election. He's down 10 points overall since January, and a lot of that is losing support amongst independents. He's tumbled 17 points with American independents, down to just 29% support. Other polls this week have been a bit kinder to the president, hitting a high of 50% in a Trafalgar mystery poll, down to Reuters on 40%. His average is in the mid-40s, so that's still better than Biden was doing, but he is down 4 points in 6 months. Concerns over the economy, tariffs, inflation, more recently the Epstein affair, have all weighed on Trump's approval numbers. Although if you thought, Chaz, that Trump sliding in the polls was going to be counterbalanced by a surge in support for Democrats, well, you'd be wrong.
Oh yeah, polling for Democrats has been decidedly mediocre, John.
Look at where we are now. Democrats are ahead, but by just 2 points. Look at where Democrats were already ahead by in 2017. They were behind by 7 points. How about 2005 on the generic congressional ballot? Ahead by 7 points, and now they're only ahead by 2 points. Their lead is less than half of where it was in either 2017 or 2005 in July of those years, the year before the midterm election. Yes, Donald Trump may be unpopular, but Democrats have not come anywhere close to sealing the deal at this particular point.
He's like America's Chaz Licciardello.
I've had slightly less red cordial. This week it got even worse with a horror poll from the Wall Street Journal. This is net favourability you're looking at, and Republicans aren't looking great. They're on minus 11%. That's more disapproval than approval. But they're like Taylor Swift compared to the Democrats, who are on minus 30. That is historically bad, even during the Tea Party era, when everyone hated congressional Republicans, including Republicans. They never fell below minus 21. Minus 30 is very, very bad. So the question, John, is that panic stations for the Democrats?
Oh, no doubt. They will be panicking. That's what Democrats do. But they're primed to panic right now because they are going through this identity crisis. How did we lose to Trump again? So they're thinking about all these things, but those polls should be taken with, if not a grain of salt, certainly the realisation that, yeah, they're bad because Democrats are saying, I don't approve of what congressional Democrats are doing because they're powerless. They're not doing anything to stop Trump doing all these bad things. It's Democrat disapproval of Democrats that are driving those numbers so low. If you actually look at the head-to-head generic congressional approval, are you going to vote for a Democrat or a Republican? Democrats are in front of Republicans. Yeah. They're still in a solid position ahead of next year's midterms. A lot could happen between now and then. Potentially a lot of bad things for Republicans because Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill may not age too well once 9 million Americans have been kicked off Medicaid because a bunch of those 9 million are Trump voters and they're not going to take too kindly to their Republican representatives. So, yeah, I don't think Democrats should be panicking. Yes, they are panicking. Of course they're panicking. Yeah,
look, I think you're spot on. This is just standard operations. Every single time a party is swept out of power, they look powerless, they look pathetic, they look contemptible, they go down in the polls. It happens every single time. And also every single time, they then rebound and pump the incumbents in the midterms when they're on the nose.
The swing back happens.
Yeah, it happens every single time. And the polls, I think they actually demonstrate this is happening right now despite that Wall Street Journal poll. For instance, if we have a look at Gallup here, you can see that 91% of Republicans have a favourable opinion of the Republican Party, while only 73% of Democrats have a favourable opinion of the Democratic Party. It's the Democrats who are the problem for the Democrats, not independents or Republicans. Once again, in that same poll, Democrats overall had record low approval ratings of only 34% because of the poor support from Democrats who were going to vote Democratic in the midterms anyway. That's why, like you said, in that same poll, Democrats are ahead by 46 to 43. YouGov shows us something very similar. Democrats' favourable ratings, they've gone down since late October last year by 4 points amongst Republicans, by 5 points amongst independents, but by 14 points amongst Democrats. They're feeling low. At the same time, the share of respondents who are willing to say they're Democrats has also dropped from 37.8 to 30.5. They'll be back. They're the Democrat leaners. They'll be back. This means nothing if those same people are going to vote against Republicans in the midterms anyway, which they are. Like, for instance, in this recent CNN poll of what share of voters say they feel extremely motivated to vote in the midterms, the Democrats, look at their edge there. They've got an edge of 72% motivation to 50% for Republicans. That gap is going to close up as they get closer to the election. Sure. Of course, it always does. But it shows that these approval polls of the parties, they mean nothing. The golden rule of American politics, John, still stands, and that is nothing drives voters like hatred of not your party, the other party. And as the term wears on, the independents are going to hate the incumbent more, because they always do, and they'll come out and they'll vote against the incumbent in the midterms. That's what I predicted.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's not just the kind of enthusiasm about voting in the elections between November next year, the congressional midterms, but also now we're seeing this structural advantage for Democrats that used to be enjoyed by Republicans. College-educated, older voters who used to be rusted on Republicans are now rusted on Democrats, who are more likely to vote in midterm elections, not the presidential elections. But it's a potential trap for Democrats, just as they found when Biden had a surprisingly not too bad midterm in 2022. Democrats are now seeming to outperform in the midterms, underperform at presidential levels, if Donald Trump is on the ballot, to get those occasional voters out to the ballot box. And that's obviously the big unknown in 2028. Do those Trump voters remain Republicans when Trump is no longer on the ballot? Do they stay at home instead? Can they be won back by some rust belters like Josh Shapiro?
I don't want to move to 2028 yet. That's a step too far.
Well, can't we do it?
But you're absolutely right about the demographics who turn out in the midterms are now Democrats, whereas they used to be Republicans, and they vote about 20% more than the other demographics do. So that is a key.
Yeah, indeed. Donald Trump's former lawyer, Emil Bove, has been confirmed by the United States Senate to sit as a judge on the Federal Appeals Court. This comes despite whistleblower complaints that he put the president's agenda basically above the law. And hundreds of former prosecutors opposed his nomination, calling him, quote, the worst conceivable nominee. Not mincing words. Democrats and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer wasn't holding back either.
It was one of the low points, not only in this Congress, but in the history of Congress, to put a man like this in such an important position as a circuit court judge. It's a disgrace. He doesn't belong there. And our Republican, he only had one qualification. He'd do whatever Trump wants.
Not so, says 91-year-old Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, who condemned the Democrats' campaign against Bove's nomination.
The vicious rhetoric, unfair accusations, and abuse directed at Mr. Bove by some of this on this committee, it has crossed the line.
I'm glad we finally found where that line has been hiding, Chaz. To explain to us, though, why this is such a controversial choice. And this is also seen as not just being about one federal judgeship.
No.
This could be about a lot more as a precedent, but also where he could end up next.
Yeah, well, people are expecting him to be Trump's first Supreme Court pick. So this could build. There are three incidents that people are referring to, John. One is as soon as he came in, he purged pretty much anyone who had anything to do with January 6th in the Department of Justice, which, like, even good prosecutors who they didn't want to be involved in January 6th. I mean,
it was their job.
I mean, investigating January 6th, not participating.
Right.
That was their job. They were told to do it, and then they got sacked for it by Bove. That's the first thing. The second thing is he basically let off Eric Adams on a blatant corruption charge. He wrote a memo about this because he was accused there was a quid pro quo to try and help out Trump's agenda. That's the reason they let him off. Well, in his memo, to justify it, he openly said the prosecution had unduly restricted Mayor Adams' ability to devote full attention and resources to the illegal immigration and violent crime that escalated under the policies of the prior administration. So that's as good as admitting it was a quid pro quo to help Trump out. Furthermore, he explicitly acknowledged he'd reached that conclusion without assessing the strength of the evidence or the legal theories on which this case was based. He didn't even pretend to do his job as Assistant Attorney General. He just did whatever Trump wanted, like a henchman. And the third thing he did was when Trump brought in the Alien Enemies Act to try to deport Venezuelans without due process, I might add. Bove called everyone together and he stressed to them that those planes needed to take off no matter what. And then Bove raised the possibility that a court order would enjoin those removals before they could be effectuated. But according to two whistleblowers, he said that the DOJ would need to consider telling the courts, "F you," and ignore any such order. This is a guy going for a job that he's actively undermining only months ago. And by the way, all those stories are good. There are whistleblowers all over it. One of the whistleblowers in that second story had him on tape.
Right.
And then he lied to the Senate about what he was on tape saying, and the Senate wouldn't even listen to the tape. So what we got here is we have a full henchman purging maybe 50 good prosecutors just to satisfy Trump's whims.
Yeah.
We've got a hatchet guy who's going to be a judge. Now, who cares if one hatchet guy is going to be a judge? The problem is this a precedent where there's going to be another one and another one and another one? And if there is, what that means is people in the Department of Justice, if they want to get ahead, they know what they need to do. They need to be hatchet guys. They need to stop trying to be good prosecutors and follow the law. They need to follow Trump's whims instead. And that's concerning for America. It's also concerning for the future because if Trump stacks the judiciary full of loyalists and tribesmen, then when the Democrats get in, nothing's going to stop them stacking the court. Because until now they're gone, well, at least they're respectable judges, so we might disagree with them. But not if they're just, Republicans win every time, Trump loyalists.
Yeah.
And so I'm really concerned with the future of the Supreme Court if this is the direction we're going.
Yeah, indeed. And we don't yet know whether this is just a one-off kind of outlier as a Trump loyalist. We also don't know if he is such a loyalist. There's some evidence to suggest that he's actually just a bit of an operator. He's a pragmatist who's going along with Trump to get along, and this is the prize that he wants, and maybe a Supreme Court seat as well. But once Trump is gone, who knows what this guy does, but we'll see. What is in a name? Donald J. Trump would say plenty. For decades, his name was his personal and professional brand on office towers and apartments, airlines, casinos, steaks, wines, hotels, golf courses, Bibles, sneakers, even meme coins. The potency of that Trump brand may help to explain why Donald Trump seems to have a real thing about names. Renaming the Gulf of Mexico, reinstating the name of military bases glorifying Confederates, scrapping the traditional name of America's highest mountain. Republicans, keen to flatter their leader, have even proposed a bill to rename the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts the Trump Center. And now, Donald Trump has sporting teams in his sights.
The Washington Whatevers should immediately change their name back to the Washington Redskins football team. There is a big clamoring for this. Likewise, the Cleveland Indians, one of the 6 original baseball teams with a storied past.
Quick fact check on that. The Cleveland team, now called the Guardians, was founded in 1901, one of the original 6, and it was then named the Blues. They then became the Broncos and then the Naps before being renamed the Indians in 1915. In 2018, Cleveland retired their cartoonish mascot known as Chief Wahoo, and 3 years later, they got around to changing their name after a survey of 40,000 fans told them to do so. Meanwhile, the Washington football team, first known as the Braves, then the Redskins, became the Washington Commanders in 2020. Fans of the old Redskins, though, used to paint their own faces red to go to games. Now, Trump even claims that Native Americans are opposed to those changes and want the old names back.
Our great Indian people in massive numbers want this to happen. Their heritage and prestige is systematically being taken away from them. Times are different now than they were 3 or 4 years ago. We are a country of passion and common sense. Owners, get it done.
Claiming this is some kind of cultural erasure of Indians. And then, a few hours later, came this threat.
If they don't change the name back to the original Washington Redskins and get rid of the ridiculous moniker Washington Commanders, I won't make a deal for them to build a new stadium in Washington.
And then, speaking of ridiculous,
Indians are being treated very unfairly. Make Indians great again. Mega.
It's unclear what, if anything, Trump can do to pressure the Commanders over their stadium plans, given it's mostly privately funded and the remaining $500 million is coming from the District of Columbia itself. Still, there are other sporting teams that are holding on to racially controversial names, like the Atlanta Braves, who, by the way, were once the Boston Bean Eaters. They're keeping the name, but they're losing the old Tomahawk logo. Meanwhile, under pressure from consumers inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, brands featuring stereotypical characters like Aunt Jemima, Mrs. Butterworth and Uncle Ben have all been retired, and Eskimo pies have been rebranded. But Trump has long claimed that all of that is cancel culture at work, and now he seems intent on winding back the clock. For more, I spoke to Mark Macarro. He's the president of the National Association of American Indians, and he's concerned about Trump raising this issue again and what effect it might have.
The timing of that certainly felt like a distraction to I think, the general population, because it on its face, especially to us, felt like, oh my gosh, is he really doing this again? Because this was a settled matter. I mean, the team in particular, the Washington football team, I want to minimize my use of the old moniker. They agreed under the old owner to finally change, and he acquiesced and he agreed to change the name after 20 years of a lawsuit, which had mixed results. But then the Patent and Trade Office here in the United States, they ruled that moniker, the Washington R-word team, name of the team, was in fact disparaging to Native Americans. And so on the heels of that, just before the 2020 seasons, when the team decided to drop it.
Mark, It's interesting to hear you talking about the R word. I guess we're all very familiar with the horrible, hurtful, racist history of the N word and know not to use it. Are you saying that we should be thinking of the R word as being just as problematic, just as hurtful?
It absolutely is. There is an equivalency in that it's a slur. It comes out of a historical context where it was intended to be a slur, intended to be a pejorative. That R word, I'm going to say it just this one time, the Redskins word, in its proper historical context, comes out of a time in American history of extreme violence and attempted extermination of our people, of our tribes. And so, in particular, it comes from when our Indian ancestors were scalped by U.S. Army soldiers and others who were trying to steal our lands and eventually did. And so on our skin is a reference to the blood-stained scalp or skin of a native person. And so, yes, it's a pejorative. Yes, it's a slur. But yes, it is an inhuman reference to a method of what happened when our people were encountered by colonizers in trying to take their lands.
Mark, we just heard President Trump's post on Truth Social where he said that our great Indian people in massive numbers want this to happen. In your experience, where does public opinion, and particularly amongst First Nations Americans, sit on this issue?
Sometimes it appears that some of the phraseology is just being pulled out of thin air. And in our case, we know the people of our tribal nations, our tribal communities, the consensus is that the use of these terms and these images are they're harmful. They're not. We know that they're not honoring any of our people, and that they're distortions. The distortions of our culture, distortions of our history, of our regalia, and they're being used as costumes and just misused. And so there is no hundreds or thousands of Native Americans who want to continue the use of these things for these mascots because they honor us and that we want these restored. That's what maybe a few people want. I think the sports fans of some of these teams, there's a base in each one of those enterprises. I'll name them. The Chicago Blackhawks being one of them. They've not changed their name. The Cleveland baseball team changed its name, and so did the Washington team. And so there's no need to step backwards here just because one person, in this case the president, thinks that there's some consensus out there.
So, Mark, what would you say to people that grew up with these now retired team names that you say are so inappropriate, who grew up with all of these products on their pantry shelves, brands that they associate with happy memories of their childhood and loyalty to a sporting team? They don't feel as though they're being racist. They feel, if anything, you're taking away a part of their identity and their history. What do you say to them?
I would try to convey that the ongoing use of mascots is something that is, it stereotypes minority groups. It creates us as real people and as members of tribal communities and tribal nations. It, in some ways, it even makes us invisible as real present day tribal citizens. And so, when the president says something, it matters. When any president anywhere, any politico says something, it matters because, there are politico people that try to decode, did he say this? Did he say that? What did he say about this? Did he not say something about that? What does that mean? They attach meaning to almost every utterance of a politician. So in this case, the President of the United States, bringing this back up, begins to create a space where, at least to some of those in the base, they think that this is now okay to do again. When we thought this was settled and had put it in the past, it gives a cue that it's okay to continue misrepresenting and distorting tribal people. And of course, nothing's further from the truth. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that certainly in the last 10 years, and probably what was part of the final push in trying to get word out in educating Americans and those decision makers that this is in fact is harmful to Native Americans, is that we have a series of studies that have been done, that have been published, made available, quantifying an actual harm that comes to Native people as a result of the use of these mascots. You know, things change. Just because something was appropriate 150 years ago doesn't mean that it's appropriate today. We evolve, we can be adults, we can be respectful, and that would be one way to honor who we are as people, as tribes.
Mark Macarro, thank you very much for joining us on Planet America.
I really appreciate it, and thanks for being interested in this, because this is fundamentally important to who we are as people. Thank you so much.
Now to what might be the most consequential decision of the Trump administration so far. Could Trump delete the entire modern environmental movement?
So this has been referred to as basically driving a dagger into the heart of the climate change religion.
Meet the EPA chief, Lee Zeldin. He is spoiling for a fight. But let's start at the beginning. Back in 1968, the Clean Air Act established that the EPA had to regulate the emission of any air pollutant from any class or classes of new motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines that cause or contribute to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. Now, originally that was interpreted as referring to pollutants like ozone, particulate matter and sulfur dioxide, things in the air that poison you. But then in a 2006 court case, Massachusetts v EPA, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA could regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act so long as the EPA administrator determined these emissions may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. Now that's a very low bar to prove. How low? Well, under the Clean Air Act, welfare is defined to include effects on climate, economic values, personal comfort and well-being. Could climate change affect any of those things? Well, yes it could. And welfare also is defined in the legislation to include effects on soils, water, crops, vegetation, man-made materials, animals, wildlife, weather, visibility and climate. Could climate change affect any of those things? Well, yes, it could. So then in 2009, along comes Obama, and his administration happily accepted the Supreme Court's invitation to find that carbon emissions did indeed harm public health and welfare and should therefore be regulated. Now that is what is called the endangerment finding. While not regulating anything itself, the endangerment finding became the necessary prerequisite for all subsequent regulations on carbon emissions issued by the EPA. And that leads us to old mate Lee Zeldin.
EPA is proposing to rescind the 2009 Obama EPA endangerment finding to eliminate all of the greenhouse gas emissions regulations that followed, including electric vehicle mandates, which amounts to $1 trillion worth of savings.
Note the extremely ironic extreme heat warning in the corner there, by the way. But sorry, Lee, please continue.
Finalized, this amounts to the largest deregulatory action in the history of the United States, thanks to President Trump, the Trump mandate, and the American people.
Now, just to be clear, he's talking about ending all climate change regulations, full stop. Trump administration deregulator Jeff Clark estimates that Zeldin's move could save the national economy $1.7 trillion to $8.2 trillion. That's quite a range there over the next 30 years or so. And in case you're wondering, yes, he is that Jeff Clark from the January 6 hearings.
So who's Jeff Clark? An environmental lawyer with no experience relevant to leading the entire Department of Justice. What was his only qualification? That he would do whatever the president wanted him to do, including overthrowing a free and a fair democratic election.
I'm glad that good kid landed on his feet. So what's Zeldin's legal argument to kill the endangerment finding? He's got two. One, that carbon dioxide isn't really pollution. It's odorless, doesn't affect visibility, and has no toxicological effects at ambient levels. In other words, Carbon dioxide from fossil fuels won't make you sick, so the EPA shouldn't regulate it. His second argument is that the EPA overstepped its legal authority under the Clean Air Act when it wrote the endangerment finding. So Zeldin's currently writing this rule to revoke the endangerment finding. That's going to go through a lengthy process. It's going to be challenged in court, and even then it won't be over, because even if Zeldin is able to revoke the endangerment finding, that doesn't automatically revoke all the rules that rely on it. Each of those rules has to go through its own separate rulemaking process, and those will also take months. So it's going to be a long road. It's going to take years overall. And it's a road that, ironically, polluters don't even want Zeldin to necessarily travel down. Car manufacturers, for example, they're quite happy with emission standards because they know that electric vehicle sales are projected to grow from 2 million in 2020 to 73 million units in 2040. And China currently makes 76% of EVs sold worldwide. These moves from Zeldin are not going to help that situation, especially given American car companies have already gone to the trouble of building their own EVs. They've done the hard work. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel industry has faced off on dozens of lawsuits over the years, and their strongest argument has been that those cases are preempted by federal law. The Clean Air Act's regulations have barred state claims for damages due to climate change, but if you get rid of the endangerment finding and you get rid of those regulations, then those state lawsuits might come back into play. So Zeldin's opening the door there to a lot of uncertainty. Will he be able to pull it off? And if the endangerment finding just disappears, what exactly would that mean? For more, I spoke to David Doniger, a climate and energy strategist at the non-profit environmental advocacy group, the Natural Resources Defence Council. David Doniger, welcome to Planet America. Now, how big a deal in your view is the endangerment finding? If Lee Zeldin succeeds here, what does this mean for addressing climate change?
The strongest tool in the American toolbox to deal with the dangers of climate change is the American Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act provides that when the administrator of the EPA determines that an air pollutant poses a danger to health or welfare, then he has to regulate that pollution. And that's what they're trying to kick out from under us.
And if Zeldin did succeed, would that simply not force the Trump administration to regulate carbon emissions, or would it actually stop future Democratic administrations from regulating carbon emissions, even if they want to?
Depends on how they finish this thing that they have begun and whether the courts agree with them. If it's a factual judgment, then potentially the next administrator could reverse it. But if they reach a conclusion that the Clean Air Act just does not operate here and they're upheld by the courts, then we would need new laws, which is a problem.
And in your opinion, does Zeldin have any strong legal arguments?
Well, I think they're extremely weak, and they actually run against not just one Supreme Court decision, but 4 Supreme Court decisions upholding EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act to deal with climate pollution. So he's got a lot of heavy lifting ahead of him. To use an American baseball metaphor, he's swinging for the fences. But most times when you try to do that, you strike out.
And how long should that process take before we do see potentially a real world regulation?
We think their plan is to issue a final regulation repealing the endangerment finding and repealing the emission standards that depend on it by the end of the year. And that's when we will go to court. Court proceedings take probably about a year to get a decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington, which is the place where you start. And it could take another year if someone tries to go to the Supreme Court.
And David Doniger, even if Zeldin does succeed in attacking endangerment finding, that doesn't automatically repeal all environmental rules, does it? He'd have to repeal each climate change rule one by one, wouldn't he?
Well, he's trying to sort of do this in parallel. So there is already a proposal to repeal the power plant carbon pollution standards. And included in the endangerment repeal is a proposal to repeal the motor vehicle greenhouse gas standards. So those are the 2 biggest sources in the United States, and there would be a huge setback if those standards were repealed.
David, at the end of the day, is this just going to come down to whether the Supreme Court wants to knife environmental regulations? And if so, which way are you expecting them to lean?
So a lot of people have noted that our Supreme Court has shifted a lot to the right in the past few years. And they also note that the principal decision in a case called Massachusetts versus EPA dates from 2007. But the thing that most observers don't realize is that there are these three other decisions since then. The most recent one was in 2022. The author of the opinion was the Chief Justice, Roberts. And what the Roberts decision says is EPA can regulate carbon dioxide from power plants, but it did so the wrong way. It used a market-based system at a time under a provision which the court interpreted to require technology-based standards that work plant by plant. So he said, you can do it this way, not that way. And the Biden administration went back to work and issued in 2024 new standards that do it the way the Supreme Court said was kosher. So I'm not expecting the Supreme Court, even this Supreme Court, to deny the obligation to regulate power plants and vehicles that emit dangerous levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
Given how clear you say the law is, do you think Zeldin's actually really trying to change the law, or do you think maybe he's just trying to make a splash to appeal to his base?
Well, Zeldin is kind of a chameleon. You know, earlier in his career as a congressman, he actually voted against a proposal to do exactly what he's doing now. He voted against a proposal to cancel the endangerment finding. But he decided to sign up for the Trump train, and he's proving himself a very loyal and enthusiastic MAGA warrior.
Now, in the past, fossil fuel industries have not pushed to remove the endangerment finding because the existence of the finding has protected them a bit from potential lawsuits. Are there more unforeseen consequences like that out there when people attack the endangerment finding?
Two things I would mention. First is that the proposal to change course here creates maximum uncertainty for the automobile industry, for the electric power industry. If I were an executive in one of the car companies, I'd be asking myself, well, do I roll back the standards against, for my new cars? Or do I stay the course? If I make dirtier cars and Zeldin loses his lawsuit, then I may be in violation for cars that I made that were too dirty. On the other hand, what do I do? Do I just keep making my vehicles to meet the standards that are on the books now? It's a real dilemma for the car companies, and they don't know what their competitors are going to do. So it's like the kind of tariff uncertainty that Trump's on-again, off-again tariffs are creating for American businesses. The same thing in the power industry. They have to decide what kind of power plants to invest in, which ones to close, which ones to keep operating. How do they know what the rules of the road are going to be, considering these kinds of, this proposal and the uncertainty around it? So this is not helping those two industries.
David Doniger, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Thank you very much.
And that is it for another weekend edition of Planet America. Do join us on Monday night on ABC TV at 9:35 p.m. We're right after Media Watch. That is the next edition of Planet America. Yes, we have switch days from Wednesdays to Monday to get a head start on the week.
And we'll be right back here on ABC News at the same time next week. Both shows are also on ABC iView and online. And don't forget to go to the Pet Podcast. It's right there. See you.
Bye-bye.